Hey everyone, we are back with part 3 of our Let's Read of The Origin of Language by Gans. Today we're going to be looking at chapters 2 through to chapter 6. These are the chapters dedicated to withdrawing from mature language and introducing the ostensive. In the next video we'll be going over the imperative, so moving on to the second chapter entitled The Linguistic Dialectic, the chapter is concerned with the evolution of linguistic forms from the originary event through to modern mature language, and the evolution consists of 3 forms: the ostensive, the imperative, and the declarative. So, admiring Hegel, Gans wants to set out a dialectic for how these emerge from each other, similar to Hegel's principle of negation and synthesis. So the ostensive is the designation of an object, the verbal equivalent to pointing. The imperative is commands and calls to action: give me the scalpel, come here, etc. While the declarative are propositions, informing sentences, claims about the world. There is only one God, there is no God, all men are mortal, these types of things, as was discussed in the first video. And so the declarative, the basis of abstraction, is the mode of speech all of metaphysics is conducted in, and the ungroundedness of metaphysics is in taking this for granted. So the declarative mode is seen as the most natural mode of speech, when really it is an evolved form that must exist in a sort of valency with its less mature counterparts. But at the same time, it is the declarative form that allows an interplay between symmetry and asymmetry that makes human culture flexible and not just a ceremonial activity. It allows us to put the state of affairs to the group such that we can reorder our desires to meet this new perceived reality told to us through declarative speech. The original event has a symmetry between center and margin, the sacralized center and the humans worshipping around it. But language between speaker and hearer, the communication between speakers on the scene, is not symmetrical. In mature language, if someone is speaking, they have a model of reality they are communicating to, but the hearer doesn't necessarily share this model, but rather interprets the speaker's words in line with his intentions. So these asymmetries, as we will come to understand better as we see the dialectic of each form of language, they generate tensions and resentments. But the earliest tensions resulting from these asymmetries are deferred once again via new modes of language, just as the original ostensive sign had done, and the declarative, with its infinite potential for complexity, not being contingent on the intentions of the group, can defer this better than any of its earlier counterparts, and it brings a whole new world of culture with it. So the declarative doesn't become a ventricle for the nonsensical and the unintelligible. It doesn't become resented, like how many authors will come to think of the privileged sign in the sign regime, consider postmodernist attitudes towards the center, or in some instances men and white people, etc. The declarative doesn't exactly take center stage for no reason, but forgetting how it becomes the most mature form of language can conceal many things, and that is the point to take away. This is suggestive, I think, of how generative anthropology escapes the framing of postmodernism, in that it is far more permissible for inequalities to be beneficial to us. So we then move on to chapter 3, which is entitled Derridian Parenthesis, and it opens up with a segment of Derrida's essay Différance, as published in 1968. And here Gans brings to our attention the notion of différance as being important to his model, but not as important as Girard's conception of the mimetic origin in constructing the originary hypothesis. But Gans remarks on the time that Derrida himself almost participated in Anthropoetics, the journal of generative anthropology, but he actually declined after realizing that Gans didn't only want to discuss his ideas, but challenge them, which is something Gans accuses Derrida of not being interested in. Now, I've made a whole video on this again, so I'm not going to try to repeat myself, but as said before, the point here is to show some loyalty to the metaphysical tradition by not doing away with it, but grounding it in anthropological reality. Thought is not free, but is grounded in the reality of human existence taking place in a scene, in a sociality that is more than just the internal workings of one's own mind. You can tell from this account that abstraction then comes after sociality and links with many of the concepts we have been looking at on my channel. But from here we get into chapter 4, formal and institutional representation. So the originary event is no doubt also a sacred ritual paralleling all religious rites. The object that is intended upon by the community is sacralized as it is not consumed. So the first sign has the quality of being sacred, that is, that which we indefinitely desire but cannot consume. But because it is desired, there's also a finite quality to its deferral. Residual resentment will eventually require a new ostensive, and so it is at the same time not transcendental. The new collectivities form from these resentments, and eventually the original ostensive, perhaps an animal carcass, is eventually eaten. But it is still remembered as a transcendental signified nonetheless. It is remembered as what Gans refers to as the name of God. So, to elaborate, a big point of Gans' work is in establishing that atheists cannot mock belief in God, because the meaningfulness of the idea of God is the origin of meaning itself. While on the other hand, the believer in God must come to realize that until God can be represented via a sign, something that only humans can do, there is no way to attest to God's existence. In this way, God creates man, but man creates God, and it is this unification of these two things that is integral to the human condition. And this is important in responding to Derrida. Difference denies the existence of origins, as a set of differences must always be available to give anything its meaning to Derrida. But in addition to its attack on presence as authoritarian and centeredness as oppressive, Gans is turning it into something anthropological. Presence is not a veil for sinister authoritarian political forces, but is the theologically inflected understanding of the separation of consciousness from its object. To be conscious is to stand back from something and contemplate it independently of our appetite of interests, says Gans, which is what it means to sacralize something, to defer our appetite of desire for an object and create a presence outside of the animal world. Another critique of Derrida's view of language as hierarchical in its origin is that the originary sign in the form of the name of God is itself a liberation from the animal pecking order and the opening of a community that's participants are equal worshippers around a sacred center. These God Emperor types that Derrida has in mind when he makes this point, these appear on the stage much, much later. So now we really get into a deep dive into the forms of language with chapter 5, entitled The Ostensive. The form of language with the least distance between humans and animals is the ostensive, and we first move into a discussion on how the ostensive is indeed a sign and not just a mere signal. And to Gans, its significance is in that the ostensive begins as a deferral of action. It isn't just the exercising of new neurons in the brain. The proto-human group evolves to become not just more intelligent, but more mimetic. And so there is a demand put to the humans that is communicative and gives rise to a sign that is the ostensive. So Gans raises the fact that animals do not point. To Gans, the first sign only need be pointing, as long as it is conscious and every individual in the group is in joint shared attention. The individuals, they're not just pointing, but are pointing for others. So a sign isn't just a designation, but a representation as well. And this way, language is the directing of attention of an audience. And a lot of people in the comments of the last video brought up that elephants can point. Now, the research into elephant pointing comes from Richard Byrne and colleagues from the University of St. Andrews, they made it clear that what they have found are just trunk gestures, and their findings aren't sufficient entirely to conclude this as pointing, as in the admission of a sign. But the elephants, like many advanced social species such as dogs and monkeys, can actually understand human pointing. But this is an instance of second-order attention. The animal can't see me, seeing it see something else, like an animal with third-order attention can, which as far as we know is just humans. So we then move on to examine the ostensive as it moves out of its ritual origins, where the sacred and the significance are indistinguishable. When the ostensive breaks off from the sacred and becomes usable in mundane language, over time the sign spreads to less formal encounters, and it becomes an exercise in its own right. So there's a brief discussion here on this. Think of how when there is fire, we yell fire, not just to exclaim it, but to warn others such that they will mimic us and warn others too. Or how we teach children by pointing to things in picture books and ostensibly referring to them. And it is after this secularization of language that what is called felicity comes into the picture. That is the lowering of the threshold of significance as to allow for everyday objects to be referred to without the demand that they be these sacral ostensives, and also to be used in circumstances far less urgent than a mimetic crisis. We then arrive at chapter 6, entitled Linguistics of the Ostensive. Here Gans begins to flesh out what could be an ostensive language. The heuristic within the scene still generates itself in daily language, but it is profane and it's detached from the sacred, and it serves just to direct people's attentions to a referent. And functionally, an ostensive language is just made up of all nominals, like noun phrases. Even a verb like yelling stampede would just be a functional nominal, alerting people to something to be reacted to. In mature language, we can see it as a verb, but in the younger ostensive speech, it is just functionally another noun. So these details, though, it must be remembered, are only insofar as the intentional structure of the ostensive is unchanged, of which we will discuss now. The ostensive has a very limited set of social possibilities. The ostensive cannot linguistically differentiate between people. You can, of course, ostensively refer to a person, but they don't exist in the linguistic matrix. Persons aren't given unique linguistic roles to identify them, because the speaker making the ostensive, the person making the referent, is assuming his or her hearer is also standing in the same relation to the object. Because of this, the ostensive can't actually raise social concerns because of this assumption of symmetry. It's only the imperative that allows this. There is an assumption in the ostensive of shared desire in the object. When I yell stampede, I'm assuming you have the same intentions as me to avoid the stampede. While there is also no tense in ostensive speech either, that is referring to past tense, future tense, because the object is there and verifiable to the listener when the ostensive is made in that moment. I can't point to something that will be there or was there before without evoking a new intentionality. So this ability of tenseness comes later, and Gans writes that person and tense, these things are known as shifters, and the ostensive doesn't have any of them. It presents the model, but nothing else. It is a reference to the present, indistinguishable from the linguistic scene of communication. It is a context-dependent exclamation, not the sort of free conceptual thought we experience in fully mature language. And we then move on lastly to discuss the dialectic of the ostensive. The original ostensive sign was not a part of a larger vocabulary. It is fixed to the sacred center, and it must become detachable and used profanely later on. So we're going to return now to this method of a dialectic by which we examine how forms of language change the grounds by which they were appropriate and warrant new, more evolved forms. And we know how this new form was warranted by two criteria being met, that of significance and signification. So significance is when the speech is necessary. It must have been said as opposed to saying nothing. It is justified. While signification is that the sign was appropriate to the situation. In another way of explaining it, significance is how the scene of representation is reconstructed in the use of the sign, while signification is that of truth and the quality of truth. Is the sign true, although only the declarative can be truth apt? And so the ostensive, being context dependent and only concerned with the scene of representation, is solely significant and has no signification. There is no truth to the ostensive, rather it is just appropriate or inappropriate. And this creates a paradox amongst users of the ostensive, such that even when someone yells fire, when there is no fire, they have the power vested in them to construct an imaginary scene. This is where the space for the imperative is opened up. The ostensive is an expression of desire, as when you use it, you are constructing a scene of action that you would want to actualize. But the first broadening of the intentionality structure of the ostensive could be through something like lying, through emitting the sign in the absence of its object that then provokes a certain reaction that you desire. Such as the boy who cried wolf, for instance. Here is how an ostensive can be possibly treated as an imperative and generate a new form of speech. But this is something we will be discussing in much more detail in the next video, so we will leave it there then for part 3. See you next time.